Hello, Mansfield High School. This is Mr. Bowling coming to you. Day whatever of, what are we calling this now? Shelter in place, isolation, quarantine. Hopefully you're doing well. Today I'm going to talk with all of our classes, myself, Coach Harden, and Coach Haltom about one of the, probably not one of the, but the most unpopular war in American history, the Vietnam War. There will be another video placed onto Google Classroom with some instructions about where we've gone so far. Again, we're trying to make this as close to being in class as possible, especially my students. Hey, here I am, look at me. There will be some terms uploaded based on this lecture for you to define, okay? So let's get started. Vietnam. In 1954, most Americans had never heard of Vietnam. Vietnam was a country that had been controlled by China for roughly 900 years and then by the French for about 150 years afterwards. It was taken over by the Japanese during World War II, and after the Japanese were defeated, the French tried to reassert their control. The problem is French was a decimated country. So in 1954, the Vietnamese defeat the French at a small village in North Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu. Here's a problem from the American perspective. The Vietnamese who defeat the French were communists, led by Ho Chi Minh. As you know, we have our containment policy. We don't want communism to spread. So we are instrumental in getting a conference called known as the Geneva Conference that divides Vietnam along the 17th parallel, just like Korea had been divided. North communist, south non-communist. And it was supposed to be reunited with elections during 1956. Moving forward. This is the North Vietnamese leader, Ho Chi Minh. He was affectionately known as Uncle Ho. Quit laughing. And he was beloved throughout most of Vietnam. Somebody quit texting me over there. Moving forward. So, why did we get involved? Okay? One of the first terms that you will need to understand is the domino theory. And this becomes the basis for implementing our containment policy throughout really most of the Cold War, and especially throughout all of Asia. And the theory being, if one country fell, other countries would fall to communism, just like a row of dominoes. So it didn't matter. We felt if we're in Southeast Asia or we're in Mansfield, Texas, we have to stop the communists where they're at. Initially we sent, wait, go back one, Coach Harden there, and let's see what, okay. So we initially sent advisors under President Eisenhower. President Kennedy sent more advisors. What does that mean? We were basically teaching the South Vietnamese how to wage war and how to fight better, but we didn't have any, quote, combat troops. That was under Kennedy's administration. Obviously, Kennedy is assassinated. Moving forward now. So what brings us into the war in our next key term? In 1964, an American destroyer was in the Gulf of Tonkin. I'll show you a map in just a second where the Gulf of Tonkin is, but it's basically off the coast of North Vietnam. And we had a destroyer patrolling those waters. And it's attacked. Now, there is some question as to whether it was a provoked attack or not, but it was attacked. And President Johnson goes to Congress and basically says, we have to protect American lives. And so Congress gives him the authority to take any necessary measures to protect American troops. That is what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The importance of that resolution is the increase in presidential power, as you can see on the screen. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is not a declaration of war. We never declare war in Vietnam. But Johnson uses it as the authority to send combat troops. And so by 1965, we send our next combat troops to Vietnam. Over the next 3 years, we sent more and more and more and more. Okay? Go forward one, I may ask you to come back later. All right. Here is a map showing the Gulf of Tonkin. Here you can see North Vietnam, the capital city of Hanoi. Right about here is where North and South were divided. The South Vietnam capital, I don't know if it's on there, but it was further down in the south. So that's the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Go forward one more. All right, we start the way we waged war. We thought initially that we could basically bomb the Vietnamese into surrendering. Now we start a series of bombing campaigns known as Operation Rolling Thunder, Operation Linebacker 1, Linebacker 2, a number of things. And here you can see the amount of bombs. We dropped more bombs in Vietnam than we did in all of World War II. And I think maybe in all American wars combined. If you keep going down a little bit, Coach. The point of this was seeking a quick victory, okay? The problem is we didn't get that quick victory. Go back to right here. Okay, 1965, 1966, 1967. We kept sending more and more combat troops. Now keep in mind, Vietnam is a backwards nation, at least at that time it was. And we could not understand why we aren't winning this war. The fact is, a lot of Americans didn't understand the way the war was being fought. Is there any chance you can pause that?
No, we'll cut in 2 videos.
Oh, okay.
We can start over.
No. It all comes to a head with the Tet Offensive in 1968. In January of 1968, Tet is the Lunar New Year that is celebrated over in that part of the world. And there had always been a ceasefire, just an agreed upon ceasefire. And in 1968, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, and they are two separate things, I will explain briefly. Viet Cong were southern Vietnamese citizens who were communist followers. Basically, they were peasant farmers by day and guerrilla soldiers by night. Then there was the regular North Vietnamese Army. Well, there was a coordinating attack in January of 1968 against every, basically, major city, major town, whatever, throughout all of South Vietnam. And this is the turning point of the war. Eventually, we push back the offensive. This is known as the Tet Offensive. Eventually, we push it back, but the reason why it's the turning point of the war is it indicated to Americans that, number one, the Viet Cong would not ever surrender, and after over 3 years of fighting, we were no closer to winning against this small, sort of third world nation than we had been from the start. Okay? I'll be right back. And I'm back. Now, next one of your key terms is the role of the media in Vietnam. This becomes what is known as the first ever televised war, okay? We've talked about it in our classes. War is not a fun time. War is killing. War is casualties. But previously, you couldn't sit down for dinner at night and see the coverage from the war, okay? Now you could. There were reporters on the ground reporting back from Vietnam. Here you see what was known as the most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite. He was the lead anchor for CBS Evening News. And what this creates, the role of the media was to show the war how it really was. The government was telling Americans, everything's going well, we're getting better, etc. We're close to winning the war. We just need a little bit more time, a few more troops. But television was telling a different story. And when, Ma and Pa Jones in Sioux Falls, Iowa, or Sioux Falls, South Dakota, wherever it is, when they sat down for dinner after, or sat down to the TV after dinner, and they're like, well, looky there, honey, the government says we're doing well, but we're not doing well. We okay?
Yeah, it's still going.
And so what this does is creates what we call a credibility gap. And a credibility gap means the government was not trusted because the media reported facts at odds with White House reports. I would argue with you, in my lifetime and definitely your lifetime, the government has never been trusted like they were previous. And a lot of that starts with Vietnam and some other problems and scandals we will deal with later. The government's main response, hang on. The government's main response next term is a silent majority. What they said is there were a handful of Americans who were against the war. But most people were a silent majority. In other words, they supported it. They just weren't vocal about it like these very, very strong anti-war people. And more Americans showed a reluctance to go to war. Okay, so here you see President Johnson visiting troops in Vietnam. And Vietnam politically is the end of Johnson. He is decimated by the response to this war. Keep going. Here's a famous scene from Vietnam. Buddhist monks protest Diem. He was one of the South Vietnamese leaders we supported. Diem was actually a Catholic. The majority of Vietnam is a Buddhist country. He had harsh policies towards the Buddhists, and so to protest that, there were some Buddhist monks that literally, this is a monk sitting in the streets of Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital. They poured gasoline over themselves and lit themselves on fire, just sitting there stoically as they burned to death. The problem is, when Americans saw stuff like that, they thought, my God, how could we support a ruler that sparks that type of response? Moving on down, we've already seen that one. Oh, this is interesting with Vietnam. One of the reasons we had trouble in Vietnam is it was very hard to find the soldier, the enemy. Sometimes it was because the country is so jungle filled and mountainous. Here you see the thick foliage. So the enemy hid from us. Sometimes it's because we didn't know who the enemy was. These Viet Cong guerrillas, or sometimes you would hear them called Charlie, Uncle Chuck, VC. We had a number of nicknames for them. As I said, they were peasant soldiers by day. It wasn't like in World War II when you come across, hey, there's the Nazis. They're all in their uniforms, and we know who to fight. These people were sometimes hiding in plain sight. They also built elaborate tunnel systems throughout the country. Many times, we were walking right over them. And they had these elaborate tunnels with full bedrooms and kitchens and stuff underneath. There were booby traps all over the place. It was guerrilla warfare at its finest, really. One of the ways that we got rid of the foliage, so to try to ensure that the enemy could not hide, was using something known as Agent Orange. And Agent Orange, as you can see, was a chemical, and it basically would kill the vegetation. What we didn't know is it also caused cancer. And a number of our veterans experienced significant issues with that, including death from being exposed to this. The other thing we did was drop a jelly gasoline substance known as napalm. And napalm would be dropped from airplanes, and when it would hit, it would light basically everything on fire. And this is a very famous picture known as Napalm Girl, and her village has just been napalmed, and her clothes catch on fire, and she strips off her clothes, and she goes running down the street. And the problem is, for us, the problem is that it's captured by some cameramen, and this goes for 1972 or whenever it happened, 71 maybe, what we would call viral. Now, that girl did live. She later immigrated, I believe, to Canada. But we become sort of the bad guys. My God, how are we doing this to people? Here you see some of our soldiers in the thick foliage and what they had to deal with. We would go on what we called Zippo raids. And here, this soldier is using a Zippo lighter to burn down a suspected safe house for Viet Cong. The problem is that didn't really endear us to the locals, okay? It would be like going into someone's neighborhood. Sometimes you had evidence, sometimes you didn't have evidence, and saying, hey, I think you're a criminal, and just basically burning your entire house down. We just didn't always endear ourselves to the locals. And what that led to as the war drug on was more and more anti-war demonstrations at home. And this is another one of your key terms, the anti-war movement. It was mostly young, college-age kids. They challenged the materialism of American society. Look at us, we're Americans, all we want is bigger cars and bigger houses, whatever. And the fact is, this became very, very unpopular because of this, the draft. We have not had a draft since I was 4 years old. I think it ended in 1973. Back then, a ton of young people lived with the very real possibility that as soon as they're out of high school, they're being drafted. And there were many families that dealt with someone coming home in a flag-draped coffin 6 months later. That was the reality. These people didn't want to go to the war, but they were forced to go to the war. Perhaps the most famous American at the time who resisted the draft was Muhammad Ali. And he famously said, I've got no quarrel with the Viet Cong. In fact, to allude to the next unit, civil rights, he said, the Viet Cong has never treated me as poorly as I've been treated in America by white people. He had a little bit of a point. The problem is, if you resisted the draft, you went to jail. If you didn't go to jail, it's most likely because you had fled the country and were known as a draft dodger. And thousands of Americans did go to Canada. The other reason the draft is very popular is it was very, very slanted towards social class. What that means is if you had the money to go to college, you could get what was known as a deferment. For 4 years, you were in college, you were ineligible to be drafted. The people from the lower economic levels, that college wasn't an option, they didn't have that deferment. So what that means is a lot of the people fighting the war, at least the frontline soldiers and infantry, were from the lower socioeconomic classes and also minorities. And that led in the next key term, in 1971, the 26th Amendment to be passed. Up to that point, you had to be 21 to vote. The fact is, the average age of a soldier in Vietnam was about 18 and a half to 19 years of age. And so a movement started that, these kids can go fight and die for our country and they can't vote for the people sending them there. So the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. That makes 5 amendments that specifically give people more powers to vote. The 15th Amendment, which gives black males the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. The 23rd Amendment, which gives presidential voters to electoral votes to Washington, D.C. Which one am I forgetting? The 24th Amendment, which eliminates the poll tax. And finally, the 26th Amendment, which lowers the voting age to 18. As we go on, anti-war demonstrations continue at home. As the media coverage continued, fear of escalation to nuclear conflict led to more people wanting out. The media started to publish examples of the government basically telling falsehoods about our involvement. One of those, and I'm not going to ask you about it, is known as the Pentagon Papers. In 1970, the most famous protest occurred at Kent State University in the state of Ohio. And colleges became hotbeds of protest. And it really spilled over on May the 4th, 1970, in Kent State, which is sort of between Canton and Akron up in northeast Ohio. And students have been sort of clashing with the National Guard, who had been called to campus to restore order. Someone, no one knows who, but someone ordered the National Guard to fire into some students. And what ends up happening is 4 students end up being killed. And several others were injured, including at least one, who was paralyzed for life. And a couple of those students who were killed were not even protesting. One of them was walking to campus about, several hundred yards away, and a stray bullet struck them down. And so that led to further protests. Here you see some of the young people on the Capitol steps protesting the involvement in the war. This is a picture of the Kent State campus. And you can see it's not near, but it's basically riot conditions. And those 4 people become symbols of the anti-war movement and the growing belief that America should get out of this war. Here you see the burning of a draft card. That was a very popular symbol of protesting the draft. Continuing on. Perhaps the most famous American, and I'm guessing none of you guys are familiar with this lady. She's still alive. She's like 80 years old. Her name was Jane Fonda, and she was a very, very, very popular actress. Whoever your popular actresses are today. I don't even know.
Scarlett Johansson.
Scarlett Johansson. If she's still popular. She was it. And she went to North Vietnam, and this is a picture of her sitting with the enemy, with North Vietnamese soldiers. And for that, she was given the nickname Hanoi Jane. And to this day, there are many veterans who cannot stand Jane Fonda. Perhaps she went a little bit too far, but that's probably the best known protest against American involvement. Continuing on, we're almost finished here. In 1968, Richard Nixon becomes president, and his campaign promises peace with honor in Vietnam. In other words, he's going to start pushing for a peace treaty. The problem is we never really understood our enemy. And the way the Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh, well, actually Ho Chi Minh passed away in 68 as well. He does not live to the end of the war. But we never understood the resolve of the Viet Cong. And that is, what they really wanted was just independence. They sort of took the tactic that we did during the American Revolution. If we lined up and faced the English, just army against army, we never would have beaten the English. But using guerrilla tactics and sniper tactics and realizing we just had to stay in the game long enough to get England to give up, that's what really ultimately gave us our independence. Same thing in Vietnam. As the war drug on more and more Americans grew tired of it. And this became our longest war up to that point in our history. I believe that what we've been doing over in the Middle East for the past 18, 19 years has surpassed that. But we were getting no closer to victory. And so Nixon begins withdrawing our forces under a policy, key term known as Vietnamization. What Vietnamization is the withdrawal of U.S. soldiers and putting the Vietnamese in, basically bringing more Americans home and more South Vietnamese have to fight the war, making them responsible for their own war. By 1973, we reached an agreement with the North Vietnamese and we withdrew our combat soldiers. The war was still going on, but we were no longer a part of it. Now, when we withdrew, the North agreed to respect the sovereignty of the South. They don't live up to that. And by 1975, the only troops we had left over there were basically Marines guarding our embassy in Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital. On April 30th of 1975, the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, falls to the communists. And that is, I believe, the last of no, not quite the last, but the fall of Saigon. And what that is the end of the war. The communists win. Okay? We had all of our troops out except for a number of POWs. You can see that. Continue on. Here you see President Nixon explaining his Vietnamization policy, and this is South Vietnamese soldiers. We're training them to take care of the war. This is a very famous picture. These are some of the last people that got out of South Vietnam. This picture was taken on April 30th, 1975. That is the roof of the American embassy. And a number of these people were Vietnamese women who had kids with American soldiers. Those kids immediately became American citizens. They were American diplomats, whatever. Not everyone got out. If you did not get out, you were either killed or imprisoned by the communists. So, in fact, a lot of Vietnamese families in America today can trace their roots to our country to this time period. And almost done. The impact of the Vietnam War. And I think this is the last of the key terms. In 1973, Congress passes what's known as the War Powers Resolution. It takes back power from the president. And it says, as you could read, the following. President must notify Congress within 48 hours if using force, and he can only send troops for 90 days without congressional approval. Now, that's been used a number of times. For instance, our global war on terror was never, quote, an official war, kept getting congressional approval. But the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that got us into Vietnam gave the president the authority to do basically anything he wanted. This is Congress taking back some of their authority. And citizens are more reluctant to get involved in a prolonged conflict. This is key. Mistrust of government and that credibility gap. I don't think we have ever trusted our government like we did back in the 50s. The 50s was this Pleasantville time that we discussed before spring break, and if the government said something, we basically believed it. Well, the media becomes increasingly important in our lives, and I would argue still is today. There's another impact, Roy Benavides, and he's in your teaks, is a Congressional Medal of Honor, just like Alvin York previously, and Vernon Baker from World Wars I and II, respectively. And what Texas, or the state education agency, is trying to get us to understand is that diversity. It doesn't matter who we are, we, contribute to our country. All right, I think that is, and I don't know how long I just did that for, Coach. I tried to keep it within 20 minutes. What are we at?
26.
26 minutes. All right, that was off the top of my head. And are we still videoing? I'm going to finish.
Yeah, we're
it.
still reading.
All right. I know this isn't the best teaching, and I just stood up here and just winged it, basically. I don't think I had a single dad joke for my classes. Sorry, or maybe that's a good thing. There will be terms in iTunes U. Use this video to answer those terms. You obviously pause it, whatever, or whatever you want to answer those terms. And that is a quick run through Vietnam War. That's it.